Wow, everything's happening. Does anybody else have their system running slow right now, or is this just something at my end? Yeah,
Had
kind of.
Wi-Fi issues all week.
Yeah, slower than usual. Yeah. Okay. So good. Well, it's bad because it's bothering all of us. It's good because it's not just me. So anyway, all right. So before we, go into the lesson proper, does anybody have any questions about, anything in the syllabus or anything that's coming up or anything like that where you looked at Moodle or you looked at the syllabus and something didn't make sense? Okay. Now, one of the things a couple of students have mentioned to me is that they're really kind of put off by people who have a blank screen. Okay. I mean, it is a weird kind of Zoom decorum. It's like, on the one hand, if your whole situation's a mess and everything else, okay, everybody's life intrudes. I am passing on an observation from a few students who were sort of irked that people were not. I'm wondering if it was because they're thinking, well, if your camera's on, there's off, there's no way to know that you're actually really there, that you're attending. And that's true. That's true. So I would suggest that it would probably be better if everybody fired up their camera. Ultimately, I suppose you have to make that choice, but I don't really have any way of telling if you're participating if I can't see you. My part of my feeling there is that, look, if you don't want to participate and you don't want to show up and you want to pay the fees, that's your call, But if students say something, I pass it on. And a few, I was surprised at how many students in one way sort of sent me an email like, hey, what's the deal with people who shut their cameras off? Well, I'll mention it in class. I kept saying I'll mention it in class. So for those of you who were concerned, I mentioned it in class. All right. We still got some blank screens. So we clearly have fictional students. These are people who actually don't exist. I'm just going to tell you, All right. Anything else? All right. If you look under module 2, which is weeks 3 and 4, we're in week 3, so we're right where we need to be in terms of the schedule, even though we kind of functionally lost week 1. There are 5 areas where I want you to do some reading: industrialization, urbanization, secularization, globalization, and deindustrialization. We're going to go through those. We're not going to do them all today. We'll do a few today and we'll do a few next week. And then you will have an assignment due, if all is well, you'll have an assignment that will be due on Sunday the 17th. That'll be your next assignment. And you'll know what the assignment is. It's posted. I'm looking at it. I think I've mentioned I don't want to make it visible till we're ready to do the assignment because I don't want you just reading or studying to the assignment. I want to have a general discussion of the material. The other thing is, I mentioned this before, I'll mention it again. The class is going to be a lot more useful and a lot more interesting if you have at least taken a look at the assigned readings before we discuss them in class. I say that in every class, every term, and there are always a lot of people who don't do it. But I'm just going to say it makes the class more interesting because you have more to contribute. You actually will learn more because if you've already looked at the material and then you're sort of looking at it again in class, that's a second go over on the stuff. You're more likely to retain it, and you're more likely, rather than merely remembering something, you're more likely to actually learn it, to understand what it is and how it can be applied. Okay, so it's better if you kind of come in prepared.
Would you like us to take notes when you're lecturing? Because I took notes when I read the assignments.
Mhm.
Would you like us to also take notes when you're lecturing?
Oh, well, that's totally up to you. I mean, that's
Okay.
if you, I mean, it's not a bad idea, but if you feel like you don't need to take notes, like some of these things are pretty straightforward. But some of them are a little more complex, or like in the case of industrialization, yeah, it's a Wikipedia entry, but it's long, it's complex, and there's a lot of information there. So what I usually will do is highlight the things that are kind of most significant to the study of international studies and to what we're focusing on in class. But I'm not requiring that you take notes. Now, in my upper division classes, I actually require students to do summaries of all the readings, because I found that even at the upper division level, students will not read. If they know they can get away with it, students tend not to read. I think it has a lot to do I don't agree with those of my colleagues who say it's because students are lazy. I think it's because you get information differently, and a lot of you generationally just don't get information from the printed page the way previous generations did. You get it from video, you get it from audio, you get it from those kinds of sources. So that's that. Oh, now let's start then with industrialization. Some of you might notice that one of the things that's sort of conspicuously absent from this list is either imperialism or colonialism, okay? And there's a reason for that. I'm not saying it's good reason, there's a reason for that. And it is that, first of all, I think the concepts of imperialism and especially of colonialism have become really politically loaded in a way that really it has a powerful impact on 21st century scholarship and pedagogy, you know, the way people teach now. For example, in general education, we're revising general education at SOU, which we do, you know, sort of periodically. This is a pretty significant revision. And one of the general education areas where, you know, our focus is, you know, is what's called EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's the most explicit invocation of anti-racism and anti-colonialism as being required of those classes that I've ever seen. And it's not a judgment. It's just, it's really striking that that has become politically charged. So I'm not ducking out on it. I thought we're going to discuss it throughout the term. I haven't yet found a kind of politically diffused or general discussion of those concepts that works very well. So, I also was reluctant to give you an additional reading, but there hasn't really been a more transformative phenomenon in human history, I would suggest, than the notion of empire and colonialism. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that when you look particularly at industrialization, there were empires long before industrialization. But normally what you find with empire and with colonialism and the colonization of things, of territories, and the colonization of people, is it's often to facilitate an expanded scope of power. And usually, almost always, it's a consequence of a kind of what's sometimes described as an asymmetrical technological advantage. It doesn't mean that you're better than the people that you're colonizing. It means you have a technological capability that allows you to do that. And it can be something, you know, something as obscure as like whether or not you've domesticated horses, or whether or not you've perfected the longbow or artillery or whatever it is. It's usually a technological advantage for the purposes of dominating and subjugating people, okay? Since we settled societies, that has always been a powerful transformative phenomenon. And there have been a number of historically significant empires, okay? But I teach a separate class on empire and decolonization. So if you want to get into that, I would say think about maybe taking that class when you're upper division. So I'm not dodging out on it. It's just that what I'm trying to suggest with these 5 trends is that these are things that are characteristic of the world now. In other words, one of the problematics about studying colonialism and empire is that, particularly with the demise of the Soviet Union and bipolarization, there's been a kind of a loss of the thread of, well, is the United States still an empire? You know, clearly the United States is struggling internally. Are we still an empire? Were we ever actually an empire? You know, what were our colonies if we had an empire? Does every empire require colonies? So you see where this can become very complex very quickly. We're going to talk about it more, but for now, let's hold in abeyance these significant historical phenomena of empire and colonialism, because I want to talk about them in their proper place. And I'd rather talk about them separately, because I think they have that much transformative impact on human life, okay? All right, so if we look at industrialization, is it fair of me to assume that some of you at least have taken a look at the industrialization article? It's the Wikipedia. It's not bad. It's pretty clearly written. It's kind of like reading history. One of the things I look for, and you should also think about looking for if you're using Wikipedia, when authoritative statements, categorical statements are made, are they cited? Are there notes? And are those notes generally peer-reviewed and scholarly? Because that means there's been a lot of scrutiny before somebody made those assumptions. It's not just somebody, who's just dropping something in and editing a Wikipedia. You look for that sense of the integrity of scholarship. So the first thing with industrialization is the idea that, well, you tell me, when we talk about industrialization, what does that mean? What does it mean to industrialize? Because this has happened in waves in human history. Rather than put up a raised hand, just go ahead and jump in.
Oh, I was going to say I think part of it was the mechanization of the means of production. So instead of cotton or cottage industries where everything is sort of made by hand in limited numbers, now you actually have factories with automated production methods for whatever product there that you could want for clothing or for weapons or things like that.
Okay, what you're describing would be late industrialization, okay, because factories are relatively new, but you're right, that's right. Most people think of, if you're playing along at home and making notes, one of the things would be the mechanization of production. That is, to substitute mechanical energy for animal energy, for human energy, for ox energy, for horse energy, or whatever. To the extent that you are mechanizing production, all right, or as Louis talked about, the means of production, the way through which we produce and reproduce, society and economy. Well, I don't know. I would say no. I wouldn't say early industrialization is the discovery of the engine. It depends on how you define engine. I think, again, that's late industrialization. Early industrialization could be described as, using water power. Now, you can say, that's what I mean, that's an engine. Okay. But again, when you think about the importance of developing a water wheel mill, okay, it isn't a factory yet, right? But it has that mechanical structure of what would become the factory and mass production. But it's not necessarily the same as mass producing finished goods. All right, you're essentially taking something and you're grinding it up into something finer. It then can be used for more things. So you're refining a primary substance into a secondary product. When you take oil out of the ground and you refine it, okay, you're taking a kind of a primary resource and you're refining it one step, okay? In order to do that, you are applying mechanical energy of some kind. So that would be the first thing to look for when you're thinking about industrialization. Now, the question for us is not what is it, it's why does it matter, okay? So why would the development and substitution of mechanical energy for animal energy be important in human history? And I would argue transformative in human history. Well, because other places didn't do it. Well, ultimately, pretty much every place has done it. They didn't all do it at the same time. That might be important, but that doesn't tell us why it's important. Is that
it give advantage to the places that did do it at first, because everyone looked at them for, I guess, speed. Like you said, it's not like machines or it's not like factories, but in some sort of way, it was faster of getting cotton or just different materials that it wouldn't be as fast to get if you didn't have that type of industrialization.
Well, that would be getting back to when we were talking about empire and colonialism. That would be part of that technological asymmetry. That is, there's a society here that can produce more food because it's done something that's innovative that other people haven't done, who might still be sort of small nomadic hunter-gatherer peoples. So in a sense, in terms of controlling land and labor, the society that has improved the means of production to the extent that it can actually produce and store food, you eliminate the need constantly to be on the move. Once you do that, you develop culture. You develop more of a sense of culture. You can argue that those asymmetries can give you an advantage in trying to dominate other people and their land. Okay, so that would be one reason. But even just within a given society, the mechanization of labor and the means of production can transform within a society. How does that work?
The system of jobs and working class people in the class system is affected by it.
Absolutely. In other words, there's always been, as far as we know, in every society of which we have any record at all, there have been mechanisms or structures of status and power. Okay, that seems to be endemic to human existence, that you're just going to find that in every, I mean, Robert Michel called it the iron law of oligarchy, that in any group, and that would include any society, any subculture, anything, you're going to have a few people who are going to end up predominating over others. And it isn't necessarily because they're evil or anything else. Part of it is people will default to authority. A lot of people, most people don't want to lead. Only a few people really want the responsibility and the stress of leadership. Only a few people might really be suited to it, which makes democracy problematic. But for purposes of how we organize authority in a system, one of the ways historically that we've done that is the means of production. Where do you fit into the means of production? The difference between, for example, hunters and gatherers brought with it a certain kind of division of labor. Typically, the gatherers were more likely to be women and children. The hunters were more likely to be men. You see how all of a sudden the arbitrary, genetic happenstance of sex takes on a part of a power structure. Okay, what Eden was talking about is when you mechanize production, when you take it directly out of human hands and you substitute other forms of energy, you actually make a more complex, but often more hierarchical, class system begins to develop, where you have, people who maybe do no labor at all. Now, this is not new. Remember, this goes back at least as far as Plato. The philosopher class was not supposed to be a working class. That was left to slaves and producers. Okay. But in every society, to the extent that you industrialize, to the extent that you mechanize production, then you have different specialties or classes of people. You have the people who are, the notion of developing a class of people who are referred to as mechanics. That is, people who not only could invent those machines, but who could actually create them and maintain them, repair them when they were broken, understand how they worked and everything else. Then you had the people who worked alongside those machines in the means of production. This is where, Louis, we get into the notion of what would become factory labor. And but that's why I say it's not so much like suddenly we had factories, or suddenly we had mechanized labor, or suddenly we had engines where we'd never seen them before. This has happened over the course of centuries, and it's happened in waves. So the idea here is that most, again, when you talk about pre-industrial societies, they tend to be subsistence economies, which means they're subject, much more so than mechanized economies normally. They're subject to famine. They're much more subject to the cycles of nature, right? I mean, there are only certain times a year where food will grow. If you don't know how to store food, but more importantly, if you haven't mechanized production to the extent that, you can do other things, that how do you get clothing? Well, we have to get it from animals. Well, really? No. Well, we developed ways of doing cloth. We developed textiles. We did that long before we industrialized. But to the extent that we mechanized it, okay, suddenly we made it easier for people to acquire what they needed. Okay. Now, obviously, that comes at a cost. There's an immediate environmental impact of any kind of mechanization, creates a stress on an ecosystem. So you have all these things happening kind of simultaneously. So the only thing I want you to think about with the discussion of industrialization, and again, we're just kind of doing preliminary flyover today, is think of it as one of a series of transformative phenomena that have changed forever the way human beings live. I mean, in order for us to unmake the impact of industrialization would really require a complete global collapse of industrial technology. I mean, we'd have to go back to a kind of, medieval, peasant-based subsistence economy. Now, there are things that could drive us there. There are catastrophes that could take us there. But in the immediate sense, it's not likely. Unfortunately, though, going forward, when we look at things like the impact on climate, the impact on the ecosystem and everything else, those are products of in part at least, of industrialization and of our reliance on mechanized production in order to satisfy demand. Okay, so when you think about climate change or something like that, and you think about who as often human beings do, who do I blame for this? That may not be the best way to think about it, because every time you buy something off a shelf, right? Every time you buy something that's been mass produced, every time you buy something that's been produced by industrialization, you're contributing to climate change every single time. Okay, so it's not about whose fault is it. The relevant question is, what do we do about it going forward? These debates are going on, however imperfectly, in the United States legislature right now with respect to the infrastructure bill that's being proposed, but also this is going on all over the world. And we're seeing the impacts, the accelerating impacts of climate change every fire season, every hurricane season, and everything else. The number and severity of astonishing weather events is really remarkable. Well, this is what a lot of climatologists, climate scientists were predicting, some of them 15, 20, 30 years ago. If we kept going the way we've gone, we've kept going the way we have gone. We haven't changed fundamentally. We haven't. So industrialization is an important part of that, that transformation. Yeah, it allowed us to do a lot of things we couldn't do before, and those weren't all bad things, but everything comes at a cost. And your generation right now in particular is paying the price of centuries of industrialization. Okay. So if you want to blame people, go back 200 years, or at least, if that's really what you need to do. There's a lot more obviously can be said on that. I want to give you the chance to read over it. By the way, next week when we finish up, we will review. So when you're going through these materials, or if you're taking notes or something, make sure that if you have something you're not sure about, write it down. Bring your questions in, because it makes it easier for me to be useful to you in review if I know what your questions are. Okay. So it's okay if you don't understand something, but you've got to ask me a question or I won't know. Louis, did you have your hand up? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just had a question that's sort of, I guess, on topic, but a little strange. I read an article a while ago sort of talking about how with the sort of the new wave of alternative energy, like, I mean, it's not super new at this point, but like solar, hydroelectric, wind power, biofuel, etc. Do you think that or the soon to come shift to those things, does that constitute, or do you think it's going to look like a new industrial revolution, like a new wave of industrialism? Or do you think it's just sort of the next chapter, but not super significant?
I think it's kind of both. I mean,
Okay.
there obviously we're seeing the emergence of technologies that didn't exist. Hybrid technology did not exist a generation ago. Okay, hybrid technology. This is a stupid analogy, but I kind of still. It's a guilty pleasure. I really kind of like motor racing. I like Formula One and open wheel racing and stuff like that. I've only had one chance to get in an open wheel car, and my heart hasn't slowed down yet. And that was like 50 years ago. One of the things that's really striking, because I stayed away from all that for decades, because there's no place in the United States to watch Formula racing. I didn't realize how far Formula racing had gone in using hybrid technology. I mean, they've got 1,000 horsepower racing engines now that are 6-cylinder engines that can generate 1,000 horsepower and have hybrid technology. There's also a separate, I think it's called Formula E. And it's
the electric one. Yeah.
It's electric cars. Okay. So I think, is that brand new? No, there's still cars. They still consume energy. We're still using mechanical energy, or in this case, electronic energy, powering mechanical energy to do what human beings can't do or animals can't do. And yet it is certainly, I would say, an environmentally appropriate adaptation. Now, will it work? Will it help? I don't have an opinion on that because I'm not an expert, but certainly I would say it's sort of like chapter whatever in we're not
Right. It's not
deindustrializing.
like the reinvention of the steam engine. Is that sort of?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, that's one of those things where we can have an hours long discussion about all the different innovations in energy sources, which are an important component of this. Another thing that, you know, think about with industrialization is all of a sudden energy becomes a value.
Right.
You know, it's not just, you know, physical strength or, you know, do you own, you know, a string of oxen or ponies or mules or whatever. It's like, can you get gasoline? Gasoline as a byproduct of petroleum used to be considered like liquid dynamite. It was junk, it was dangerous, and often was dumped in rivers. It's only been really since the development of the automobile that we've really become reliant on gasoline. And clearly that's going to change. The question is, when we move, as we've moved to hybrid and electric cars, that brings up a whole new question, though, for us in terms of environmental impact and the future, which is, what are we going to do with all these spent lithium ion batteries and things like that? Those things are toxic. They're dangerous. And we've created another cost of the adaptation of, you know, human desire and human need and human impulse to the environment. You know, we're trying constantly to transcend, and we have done since the species started walking around, to transcend the various limitations imposed upon us by nature. I mean, that essentially is one way of thinking about, if someone wonders what's a civilization. You know, it's an attempt to collectively acting to transcend some limitation imposed by nature. To the extent that you do that, you make, you know, a permanent dwelling place, or you make a mechanical substitution for animal energy or whatever, you are transcending a limitation of nature. You're not eliminating it, but you're transcending it as a problem. You're not solving it, but you're transcending it. You're, to the extent that you're pushing past it. But pushing past problems is not always the best way to deal with them. So yeah, it's a great question. I think there are probably, maybe in environmental science, there might be some courses that you would want to think about that might look at that. The advantage, again, of a program like international studies is it's intrinsically multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. So there may indeed be a lot of electives that you could take at the upper division level that might help you answer that question, but would also satisfy, you know, the major in international studies. So in industrialization, I want you to think of it as, again, a transformative phenomenon. It's been with us for a long time. It moves, as I think Louis suggested, it moves in these kind of chapters or stages, each of which is generally characterized by a new adaptive technology and often by a new energy source or a new application of an old energy source or something like that. Yeah, I think that would be the sort of the starting point for our understanding of industrialization as it affects us globally. Anything else on industrialization? I mean, obviously there's more, but, you know, for now. Okay, great. What's urbanization? Again, rather than raise your hand, just fire away. I don't consider it rude.
It's the process of people moving into a place where there are more jobs. Correct me if I'm wrong. Or grouping together.
Okay.
Where there are more people
All
in
right.
one place.
So it would be, we can think of urbanization as the movement from sparsely populated to densely populated areas. Movement of people from rural areas to urban city. Yes, Caden, it kind of captures it in technical terms. So when we think of rural areas, we generally think of areas that are sparsely populated, that might indeed appear to be less obviously industrialized in some ways, perhaps, at least historically. And also where, again, the economy, and again, I'm sort of extrapolating backward centuries, is more characterized by subsistence. Okay. When you get into cities, when when you have settled populations, this is one of the most significant things that ever happened with human beings was the, as soon as we domesticated agriculture and realized we can stay right here and we can grow food. We don't have to just take what nature is giving us. Again, we can transcend that seasonal limitation to the extent that we can control, to some extent, by applying technology, we can control where the food grows, what food grows, and now we've developed ways of, at least however imperfectly, storing some of that food. It's why human beings have survived for so long on grains, because grains tend to store well. Meat does not store well. Fruit does not store well, but grains tend to store really well. Grains have been, an indispensable component of the human diet for about as long as we've had human beings, because they're portable. They grow just about anywhere, really, and they can be stored, and they're portable. They can be taken with you, and they can be fashioned into different kinds of food, and they can sustain you, however imperfectly. They can give you calories. Okay, but to the extent that you settle a society, all of a sudden you start developing these denser populations where, one of the things about there's an article in there that talks about, does urban mean more liberal? But remember, those are additional readings. You're welcome to read them. I think they're interesting, but they're not required. They're just things I thought you might have some fun with. And they might also give you ideas for how to respond in the written assignments and all that. Okay, Caden's got a real long comment there. I don't have time to get to it, but we'll come back to that. So the idea is that when you move, as Eden suggested, when you move into these more densely populated areas, tell me, why is that important? I know it seems like we're being really rudimentary here, but I think often we don't stop to think through these things and how significant something like urbanization has been in absolutely transforming the way human beings see the world.
Well, we move away from being like hunter-gatherer, sort of nomadic people, into we have an established civilization, which means that now we need to farm, now we need to produce. Eventually, I assume it leads to the production of things, of whatever else that you would not get as hunter-gatherers, because you sort of, I don't know, you would establish markets, you would establish schools and hospitals and military bases and whatever else comes with being in one place and putting value into staying in that place.
Well, think about it. When you settle in a location, that location takes on value that it didn't have for you before. Why do you settle there? Almost always because it's got water. Okay, because if it's got water, we're going to find a way to grow food. But if we don't have water, we won't last 5 days. Now, you can go a long time with a little bit of food, but human beings do not do well when you deprive us of water. Okay. Unfortunately, we also found out at the very same time that we discovered a river that it made a great sewer system too. Human beings spent centuries poisoning themselves. But here's the thing, though, that I want you to think about. Now, all of a sudden, you've got this place that you found, and it's like, oh, this is Eden. This is ideal. You know what? We need to keep this place. So you develop something that nomadic people do not have. You develop a proprietary stake in getting and holding land, which means it's for you and it's not for them, whoever they are. So you see how at a rudimentary human level, this really, it doesn't create, but it gives a whole new intensity to the notion of how we other people, how people are not us, they're them. And the them are the people who are going to come and try to dispossess us of this. Okay. And that's what you wouldn't need a military if you didn't have anything to defend. Okay. But you can go from that to see how this leads to our discussion of empire. You can go from that, well, we have to defend this because we worked hard to get this and we developed it. What happens when maybe you start to exhaust the land because your population is going to grow in a way that it won't grow when you're migratory? All of a sudden, you've got a big settled population. You need more land and you need more food. So there's an impulse to radiate back out again, but not in a simple migratory way. You're going out for the purpose of expanding your holdings. So this leads to the whole notion of kind of geopolitics and the whole idea of controlling the map, controlling territory. Where does this river go? Well, let's go up that river and let's take that land too, because there's people upriver there and they're messing with us. And that maybe they're, we don't want their sewage anymore. Well, we could go kill them. We could do that. Well, if we're going to do that, we need, Hugh said that we need a technological asymmetry. Well, I developed this thing and it's a long, pointy stick and it's got a thing at the end that's very, very sharp. And remember, we've had these for a long time. Here's the thing, though. Since I had so much time because we're settled and we're not marching around worrying about food because somebody else is growing the food, I made 1,000 of them. And somebody else comes along and said, hey, you know how when you get stuck with those things, it really, really hurts and stuff comes out of you? Well, I've developed this thing with these dried hides from those dead oxen that we had to do something with after we ate them. And you know what I found was that, you know, you can stick a spear into this thing and it kind of stops it. Asymmetrical advantage. You see how this works, right? But this is a consequence of people in settled areas. The more densely populated they become, all right, the more complex they become. Louis talked about, well, developing things like schools. You don't have schools when you're migrating. You don't have the leisure to do much of that. Now, it doesn't mean you're not passing on knowledge, but it means you don't have a distinct institution that you've created for the single purpose of education. What you're doing is, as you're rolling along or at night around the campfire or whatever, somebody who's, you know, some old school guy of 37, right, is telling you the way things were when that person was a kid, right? Or, I mean, you know, it was women who first, as far as we know, who first realized that if you cook food, it's less likely to kill you and more likely to taste good, but more importantly, less likely to kill you. A lot of what we know about herbs and what's safe to eat and what isn't came from women, okay? And so we start to understand, well, you know, we had a certain way that we arranged power in our society. Now that we're settled, though, and we don't need to go out and gather herbs, you know, in the same way, we can grow them and we can control them. You can manipulate your power structure. You can manipulate the status system, okay? And also, to the extent that you're developing the concept of education, you can start asking questions that you couldn't ask when you were preoccupied with just day-to-day, minute-to-minute survival. Things like, what is that fire that comes out of the sky? Or why does rain fall from the sky sometimes and not other times? And you start developing explanations for that. Now, you had really unsophisticated, perhaps, versions of that, in the sense that, you know, they usually were very naturalistic. They usually involved animals, you know, obviously always involved unseen powers and all the things. Those things become refined as you settle and urbanize. So suddenly you're developing sophisticated belief systems, okay? You're developing religions. Not just some sense that there are powers out there that you either have to fear or appease or learn to control. You're giving them, you're anthropomorphizing them. You're giving them a kind of human face. God is a white guy with a beard or whatever the silly thing is, you know. There's one God, that's mostly desert people. Almost no one else on the planet who didn't live in a desert came up with the notion of one particularly vengeful, wrathful God. The original notion of a single God was the sun. I don't think that's an accident, you know, because that notion of heat and light and all that is incredibly powerful. When you're in a settled society, you begin to contemplate those in a more than superficial way, okay? You might develop, remember when Eden was talking about how industrialization created new classes? Urbanization does the same thing, because urbanization and the permanence of society, and you know, all of a sudden we have larger populations, we begin to specialize, we begin to structurally divide labor. And those specializations can lead people to be interdependent as classes, one on another. Well, what do these people do? They're the ones who explain the gods to us. Those are the priests, often some of the most politically powerful people in a society. So that's where urbanization starts, the domestication of agriculture, the development of permanent settlements, and all of that implies. But urbanization has accelerated globally, dramatically, just in the last generation or so, and particularly obviously in the last, you know, 75 years to a century, right? What's the implication of that, of more people urbanizing now? You know, we've industrialized, we've got high technology, we've got all this stuff. You know, urbanization is happening, is much more widespread and is happening more rapidly now than at any time in human history. Why should that matter to us?
Well, I don't know if this is the right answer, but
Well, there's not a right answer. There are many
Sure.
right answers.
My first thought was that now we need to focus more on
harvesting resources, that as everyone is sort of settling down, there's sort of a grab for mainly power, food, water, shelter.
Yeah, concentrated populations make really concentrated demands on an ecosystem. And the other thing is, remember that as we urbanize, we become more dependent. Could we do what we're doing right now if the electricity stopped? No. Are any of you right now producing this electricity? Because I know I'm not. I'm just consuming it. So you see, we're dependent. And we're dependent on what? Permanent institutions that provide the goods and services we need in order for an urban environment to remain viable. This becomes very important when you look at the urbanization of areas where previously people never lived, like places like Las Vegas and Phoenix. There are a lot of urban planners and futurists who say those cities will be gone by the end of the century, probably a lot sooner, because they're not sustainable. They consume so much energy just to make those areas habitable. And it's not because of climate change, it's because historically no one lived there because they were desert. Fly over Las Vegas sometime. There's nothing there. And then suddenly there's Vegas, okay? Remember that the whole development of parts of Nevada and places like that was impossible before we developed air conditioning. We practically developed air conditioning within my lifetime. I mean, the first several cars that we owned when I was a kid did not have air conditioning. And also many of them did not have seatbelts. And, we would, every summer, we made this 11-hour drive from, where we were living in the Bay Area or wherever, all the way up to Roseburg and Grants Pass. Now, all we had to look forward to as little kids in a car on Highway 99 with no air conditioning and no seatbelts, and a kid like me who had a tendency to get car sick, all we had to look forward to was Roseburg and Grants Pass. Okay, that's primitive. That's within my lifetime. Okay, I mean, nobody, much is going to want to live like that now. Let's see, rapid shift in cultures that developed and were smaller. You're going to have to, Kate, you're going to have to help me understand that. Can you explain that? Kate just entered something in chat and it's kind of long. I'm trying not to open chat because then all of a sudden I can't see all of you at the same time. All right, so this notion of urbanization, though, it creates and intensifies interdependence. It intensifies the reliance on technology. It makes extraordinary demands on the energy infrastructure, okay, because cities, they drink up a lot of energy. All of a sudden, water becomes problematic. Ask yourself, what happens? What happens? People worried about this when the pandemic first broke. People made a big run on the grocery stores and started buying things up. That reminds you, how vulnerable we are and how dependent we are in cities. It's easy to forget that because of the convenience of a city, right? Is that, pretty much everything's there. The other thing we know is that combined with the stratification of class that, among other things, grew out of industrialization, Eden talked about that earlier. We have this idea that cities typically do become very stratified, such that in the poorer areas of cities, you can have like food deserts. You can have these places where you cannot get healthy food in as far as you can go on public transportation. The only stuff that you've got is cheap, but it's high sugar, it's high, fructose corn syrup, it's fat, it's salt, and that's all there is. That's that notion of when people talk about a sort of nutrition or food desert. That's in the middle of cities. Okay. So these are all consequences of urbanization. But the important thing is that urbanization is not something that is happening slowly. It's not something that's happening gradually. It's happening dramatically, and it's happening rapidly, and it's happening all over the world. All over the world, right? All right, any questions on that? These are the kind of things I want you to kind of begin to keep in mind and think more about, at least during this term. These are the kind of things we're going to keep coming back to. Anything else?
It's not a question. I just want to clarify what Kaden was saying because we put some more in the chat. I think they were talking about how the community and the culture of an area will shift when there are more people in it. he referenced Siam in his chat to you about the population growth and that causing a change in culture. And I think that goes back to the not assigned reading that you gave to us of the does more urban mean more liberal? Of that, since there are more people discussing, or more people being born and more people taking, or not taking, but relying on resources, it's going to cause more communication, more people interacting and stuff like that. I just want to make sure that idea got thrown out there.
Well, yeah, because, and it actually links to the next thing we're going to talk about. People who are attracted to cities may initially be attracted because of jobs and things like that, but there are still a lot of people who really are resistant to moving into urban areas, and they're clinging to this idea of, no, I mean, I like the intimacy of small towns, and you know your neighbors and all that kind of stuff, and you know we don't have all that noise and stuff from cities. You know, we know our neighbors, or we don't have any neighbors, and the closest neighbors, you know, 5 miles away or whatever, because I live on a farm. There are still a lot of people who prefer that. They tend, though, to be very different in their outlook toward the world, in their outlook toward people, and everything else. Okay, and this is why that question comes up, whether or not, you know, people in cities are more, in quotes, liberal. They're not necessarily. But what we know about people, particularly people who come to cities, want to be there and thrive in cities, they tend to be like what we associate with liberal. That is, they tend to be more future oriented. They tend to be much more comfortable adapting to change, and indeed often thrive on it. They tend to be stimulated by new things, and they tend to be less reliant on tradition. Tend to be. Cities are very complex structures, and you can have traditional enclaves within a city. It's just not that common anymore. And so that's why a lot of people think, well, cities are for liberals and the country is for conservatives. It's not that that idea is wrong, it's that it's simplistic. Okay. But also, if I'm understanding better what Caden was suggesting, because I actually read some of the things now, I had a chance to, you know, look at the chat. Cities impose change. Okay, cities impose that. Urbanization imposes change. It's a constant. Everything we were talking about with industrialization is accelerated in cities because of the dependence on, you know, the dependence on technological processes and the dependence on the means of production continually to adapt to be able to satisfy the needs and the demands of growing and concentrated populations. Okay, so the thing about cities that throws, for example, older people and makes them not want to live in cities is cities tend to be younger, things tend to happen faster, they tend to happen noisier, and they tend to be more about change and adaptation. They tend to be more on the sort of cutting edge of what's going on in the world than does the countryside. And this is why a lot of older people, not just in America, but everywhere, tend to want to move into the so-called suburbs or exurbs or out into the country because they want things to slow down. They're trying to hang on to as much of the world as it was when they were young as they can. And you can't do that in a city. If you're going to live in a city, you have to adapt. And when you're younger, typically, you kind of want that. That's where things are going on. You know, not only is that tend to be where the good schools are, you know, the good universities and all that, but also it's where all the cool stuff's happening. That's where all the bands go when they go on tour. And that used to be the thing for me is, where do I want to live? Where the good music is. You know, I didn't care about anything else as long as there was good music, you know. But you're not going to find that out in the middle of nowhere because there's nobody there, you know. So, yeah, when you urbanize, you change assumptions about history and narrative. You've really changed assumptions about the future. And that really can separate people, those who are and those who are not, more or less oriented to accept and even eagerly await the new innovations of the future. Okay, so we're almost done. I told myself we would do 3 of these today. Are we doing okay? Can we do one more? I know I feel like I'm talking a lot still, but some of the comments have been really helpful. That's good. More the merrier on that. What is secularization and why would I bring it up in the context of industrialization and urbanization? What is secularization?
The separation of, I think, Is it just politics and religion, or just the separation from religion in general?
I think it's the separation. Let's just use the word separation for now, and then we'll refine that. But it's generally the movement away from religion. And it doesn't mean that you're attacking religion. It doesn't mean that you're outlawing religion. Typically, secularization occurs as a trend along with things like urbanization. It is not a trend against religion. No, that's incorrect. Okay. It's not a trend against religion. It's a trend for religion to become increasingly irrelevant. You see how that's an important distinction. It's like when I was a little kid, I had training wheels on my bike, okay? I don't have training wheels on my car. Training wheels are irrelevant to me, right? I don't think a lot about training wheels anymore because I don't need them. My kids don't need them. We don't need them, all right? And I don't think it's just religion as a dependency, okay? Religion is much more than a dependency for the people for whom religion is important. This gets us back and is very much related to urbanization and the notion of the future as opposed to the past. Religion maybe is best understood in this context as a way of coping with the world rather than explaining it. Okay, religion does not explain the world to us. It can't. If you want to understand the world, okay, you're really not going to be able to do that through religion. However, if you're facing a crisis and you want to cope with that part of the world, religion is one way to do that many people choose, okay? In other words, you can say, well, why did this tragic thing happen? Religion cannot answer that question, except by saying something like, well, that's God's will. But the materialist is going to say, well, what do you mean by that? First of all, what's will? Secondly, what's God? Third, what's God's will? That's a secularist. Because you start asking questions that religion was never intended to be able to answer. Religion is not based on knowledge. Religion is based on faith. Therefore, religion is traditional. Okay. Religion is about preserving a view of things, a worldview. Yeah, Eddie.
Would you say that that secularization allows more free thinking?
It allows for the potential of it. It doesn't guarantee it, though. But sure, look at the number of people who would consider themselves and would behave as secularists who are reflexively believing in conspiracy theories right now. One thing about conspiracy theories, that ain't free thinking. A lot of people still default to tell me what to think. Okay, but one of the important differences of secularization is it is an environment that is much more conducive to free thinking. Okay, and I think that's probably what you meant. And in that sense, yes, I would agree with you. Religion is not about free thinking. Religion is about comfort. Think of it that way. Religion is not about necessarily projecting into the future. Religion is about maintaining the fundamental premises of the past and declaring them still to be relevant. Religion tends to be authoritarian, or at least authoritative, but most religions tend to have an authoritarian element to them. Certainly the three desert religions do, Judaism, Christianity, Islam are all very, they're essentially hierarchical structures. Okay, most religions tend to be that way. They also tend to be predominantly focused on the past. The idea being, we don't need to learn anything else about the world. We understood it, when the world was created 6,500 years ago or whatever, that idea. So again, the first assumption is that, religion and science are completely hostile one to another. I'm going to suggest that that's probably not the best way to look at that. Evan, did you have a question?
Yeah, so does secularization always have to do with religion, or could it be relevant to other traditional things?
No, it's just specific to religion.
Okay.
Yeah, in this context, it is absolutely specific to religion. And it's just the idea that the notion of accepting things on faith rather than verifying them empirically, is just insufficient. I want to see the data. I want to see the evidence of this. In other words, one of the things that religion has that science doesn't have is miracles. When religion cannot otherwise account for something, which is often, it's always got that idea, well, this was miraculous. And, many human beings want to believe in miracles. They want to believe in something more extraordinary than what they often view as this kind of inertial drag of material existence. It's like, well, things just sort of go along and then you die. Religion at least says, well, yeah, you die, but then things get good. Some religions do anyway, which is strange if you think about it, because a religion that says, yes, you're going to suffer in this life, and indeed, you should suffer because you were created by original sin, which is interesting. When a religion says that, yeah, life is shit, and then you die, and then it gets good, it's like beyond a certain point, isn't that kind of a death cult, if you think about it? Well, a religious person is going to say, no, it's a way of reassuring me that I shouldn't fear death. And indeed, that when that time comes, I should welcome it because it's inevitable. So you see, it's not just stupid, okay? But it is a way, it's a way of imbuing people with a sense of faith that ultimately things will work out. A lot of human beings find that valuable. And that's why, see, I'm reluctant to use words like dependence or something like that. It's like, am I dependent on the electricity that I have in my house? I'm not going to die if it's not there, but I can make productive use of it. There are a lot of people who, when their lives are buoyed or buttressed by this notion of faith, it gets them through the day. It allows them to raise their kids or do their job and, not become pessimistic or whatever. But it's not a substitute for people who want to understand the world as opposed to just accepting it. So in other words, one of the initial trends of secularization, and that we go back centuries here, is the movement away from fatalism, the movement away from the idea of accepting everything as inevitable. If it happens, it was meant to happen. A materialist never accepts that. That's not good enough. Religious people typically do. Okay, so as you're secularizing, you're moving away from fatalism. Okay, you're looking now not for the miraculous, but for an understanding of cause and effect. Okay, so that's an important component of secularization. Now, who's most likely to think that way? People who are well educated, people who are literate, and people who are curious. Okay. And so this notion of secularization is important because one of the things we find, for example, is that it's not necessarily accurate to say that urban environments are secular and rural environments are religious. There are certainly deeply religious people who live in cities. But we do tend to find overall people who identify as religious as a cohort in society have not only declined in the United States relative to where we've been in the past, but that this is a global phenomenon. More and more people are describing themselves as something other than religious. They may even still say they believe in a God. The problem with that kind of question is, what do they mean by God? And, if you're a deist or something like that, you can still be functionally secular. Thomas Jefferson was secular, but he was also a deist. He believed in a sort of initial prime mover or something like that. Well, if you're a Protestant Christian, that's certainly not good enough. But it's the idea that as we industrialize, as we urbanize, as we move toward, past faith and into like scientific exploration, notions of cause and effect and all that, quite naturally societies secularize. This is most obvious and most powerful in cities. Okay. Partly because we're applying the understanding of the world to solving human needs, the kind that have already been pointed out here. Where are we going to get our water? Where are we going to get our food? Where am I going to get another pair of Levi's? I can't make them myself, and none of my neighbors can. Well, we have to apply material means to satisfy those things. Religion can't do that. It was never intended to do that. Okay, but science can. Okay, so one of the important global trends, again, is this idea of secularization. Okay, now we've got two more we're going to talk about, one of which is really diffuse and has always been with us, even though a lot of people act like it's brand new, and that's globalization. And then paradoxically, we're going to talk a little bit about deindustrialization. But here's what I want to leave you with for today is that every one of these trends we've talked about, the three in particular we've talked about today, industrialization, urbanization, secularization, okay, I want you to try to think about them both in terms of they represent important transformations in human life, not bad or good, they just are. Don't worry so much about judging or condemning or approving and defending. What I'm interested in is to understand that every one of these trends transforms the way we perceive the world and the way we live within it. But it also transforms the world, okay? So there is a material consequence of every one of these things, just as there is a kind of perceptual consequence to every one of these things. You know, people who are more industrialized, urbanized, and secularized see the world differently. They actually, when they look out their window, they see a different world than people who are deindustrialized or non-industrialized or minimally industrialized, who are more rural and who are less secularized. They just see a different world. And it's why we have so-called culture wars and things like that. People are divided by these things. Not the kind of often mythic polarization that you hear about in the United States. Much of that is fabricated by American leadership. But I mean real fundamental differences. The kind of things that, for example, explain but don't justify Islamic State or something like that. We want a pan-Islamic caliphate. Why? We've seen what modernization does. You know, everything that we hold true is being destroyed by industrialization, urbanization, and secularization. Look at Boko Haram in Nigeria, same thing. Boko Haram, no Western education, by definition, because they see it as destructive and evil, okay? People will fight over these things. People will die over these things. They always have, okay? You know, you think about, you know, so-called anti-vaxxers. Go back a century, you find the same thing. You know, you find the same thing. You know, the really hysterical claims, the connections with religion are often there. The idea being almost that fatalism of, well, if you get a disease, it's God's will. You know, I mean, that's Christian Science, right? Other than, you know, remedy through prayer, there's really not much else you're allowed to do. That's not a very secular, you know, urbanized, industrialized, scientific way of looking at things. But people will draw significant lines between themselves and others on the basis of where they fit in those spectra of industrialization, urbanization, secularization. Does that make sense? All right. So again, if you have, I'm understanding that we're just getting going. You may not have had a time to look at those readings yet. You had an assignment over the weekend. You have lives to live. But at some point, do take a look at those. And then also look ahead, please, to the discussions of globalization and deindustrialization, so that when we come in next week, you know, we can cover those, then we can review, then we can discuss the assignment, which will be due the following Sunday. Okay, are we good to go? Again, as far as I know, yes, Caden, stick around till after class if you have a question. As far as I know, we're good to go for a Monday the 11th in class. And, you know, obviously, if anything changes, we'll let you know. There's no specific assignment this week. So that doesn't mean you should do nothing. It means you've got some reading to do. That's why there's not an assignment, to give you time to read. Anything else? Any other questions? All right, then I guess actually we'll see you in class next Monday. Other than that, enjoy the rest of your week.
Take care,
Thank
Professor.
you.
Have a good one.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Have a nice day.
So for my question.